The first sign of human habitation on Crete goes back to the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, around 130,000 years ago, with small groups of hunter-gatherers who possibly made their way through the Mediterranean by boat. These early inhabitants were nomadic hunter-gatherers who migrated as the seasons changed. The first sedentary farmers came to Crete around 9,000 years ago, during the Neolithic, probably making their way from the Anatolian coast, where they brought with them knowledge of agriculture and domestication of animals. Yet only few Neolithic sites are known, probably due to the proportionally larger interest in later Minoan architecture and history, combined with the smaller scale of Neolithic sites. Obviously, more time has also elapsed since the Neolithic than the Bronze Age, and perishable materials have had longer time to decay. The few settlements, however, found from this very early period can be found around the coast, often using caves as natural shelters. The Neolithic, or New Stone Age, is the last division of the Stone Age, a period defined by the introduction of agriculture with the cultivation of cereals such as emmer wheat and barley, but also legumes, mostly peas and lentils. And of course, the domestication of various animals, sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, and of course, dogs. Settlements also became much more permanent, which allowed for new social, military and political structures to develop. The origin of the core features of the Bronze Age and the Minoan civilization can be seen developed throughout the Neolithic. To put it into perspective, the Neolithic period is about twice the time span of the Bronze Age in the Aegean, yet the period has historically been passed over quite quickly, regarded as less significant than the later Bronze Age due to the perceived lack of social stratification, simpler subsistence economy, and a slower rate of change. But as time passes and our understanding of the Neolithic becomes more complex, much thanks to the increased number of Neolithic archaeological sites which have been uncovered, we start to notice how many of Bronze Age social and economic structures have Neolithic origins. And there is no doubt that there is a great degree of continuation between the Neolithic and the succeeding Bronze Age. Just like any other archaeological period, the Neolithic is further subdivided into a multitude of sub-periods. The absolute dates for these periods are sometimes debated, but it is the relative chronology, knowing that the Aceramic period is followed by the early Neolithic and then the middle, late and final Neolithic, which helps us navigate and understand the development of the Neolithic. At Knossos, the first sign of an early Neolithic settlement can be found below the later palace, where the central court now stands. This early settlement is limited to simple remains of human habitation in form of stone tools, hearths, graves and animal bones, along with architectural remains of post holes, which would have been the foundation of simple shelters. This early settlement is quite small and lack any form of complex structures. It is dated to the earliest part of the Neolithic, the Aceramic, called so due to the lack of ceramic production. If we look at the map of the palace at Knossos, we can see the central court and how it looks today. If we superimpose the Aceramic Neolithic settlement atop of the palace, where it once would have stood, we can see that as a whole it is not much larger than the latest central court at Knossos, a factor which has given rise to certain doubts regarding the permanency of this initial camp, whether it was permanent or just temporary. Regardless of the camp's function, the early inhabitants of Aceramic Knossos used a mixture of farming and livestock for sustenance, at the same time constructing various stone tools, figurines, and even basic shelters. But the first sign of a true permanent settlement at Knossos comes somewhat later, by the early Neolithic around 6000 BC, when more permanent structures were constructed using a combination of stone and clay to form buildings which were made to last. The socle of these new houses were made of either stone or rubble from older buildings, using a so-called two-skin construction, combining larger rocks, dirt, clay, and pebbles. But what truly defines the two-skin method is the position of the larger rocks when viewed from above. The rocks are found at the edge of the wall, on both sides creating a wall of rocks which would have given the building a similar interior and exterior. Then in the middle part, we find smaller pebbles, dirt and clay, which function as the glue, creating a strong foundation where mud brick could be placed atop. Sadly, mud brick is a very perishable material, and once abandoned, the mud brick decomposes quickly due to both rain and wind, with only the two-skin socle remaining. So as you visit most archaeological remains around Crete, it is only the stone-based socle which remains. The first buildings seem to have been rectangular structures with a single room and a central half. Later buildings of the early Neolithic period in Knossos incorporate more rooms and become larger, more complex and multifunctional. House C, excavated below the court at Knossos from the early Neolithic, shows new structures with clearer partition of the house, with an outer room which seems to have functioned as a storage, and an inner room with a central half. The half served an essential function as the main fireplace, used both for heating and cooking, but also as a place for social gathering. As the settlement at Knossos entered into the Middle Neolithic, the population had risen dramatically, and both the architectural and social structures had become noticeably more complex. From a small community of upwards of 50 individuals during the Aceramic period to a group consisting of upwards of 1,000 individuals, occupying a region larger than that of the later palace. The social and economic system had up to this point been defined by communality. Individuals within the group crowded together, sharing living spaces, food, cooking facilities and tools. The result is a society focused on communal and varied work, where individuals group together and participate in different activities essential to survival. This also means that goods produced, wares created, food harvested, or structures built would have been pooled together without exclusive right to any specific aspect of society. As both the household and individuals were secondary to the greater community, social hierarchies are less noticeable, especially in regards to material culture. Although we shouldn't allow for far too broad assumptions to become truths. Going back to Rousseau and his idea of the noble savage, there has been a certain assumption that these older, less developed societies, such as the Neolithic societies, are naturally egalitarian, uncorrupted by the innate evil of hierarchical modern society and guided by an innate goodness. Yet, little is known of the first half of the Neolithic at Crete and just how egalitarian the society actually was, as most materials are perishable and excavations are very limited. Trade, however, is far more common than previously thought during this period. Much of the pottery and stone tools found at early Neolithic Knossos were not locally produced, but must have arrived through either trade, gift-giving, or potentially even conflict. Some early Neolithic artifacts have travelled long distances, such as obsidian fragments from Melos, a type of volcanic glass known for its super sharp edges, which were much sought after during the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, indicating that these early settlements were by no means isolated, but trade and communication between groups were very important. Although the economy was defined by subsistence and survival without the later specialized production of wares, there are still impressive artifacts which show a true attention to details. For example, this early marble rendering of a standing male from early Neolithic Knossos, which has many parallels with Cycladic figurines, which will be common throughout much of the early and Middle Bronze Age. At the end of the Middle Neolithic on Crete, there is a noticeable change from the previous communal structure of early Neolithic society. As the settlements grew, so did individual households and houses. Production and consumption, which previously were communal activities, moved into the confines of the household, making the household a separate economic unit. Many former productions, which previously were communal, could be performed by a single household, creating an increased degree of specialization. Specialization has the benefit of generally being more efficient, creating more specialized and advanced tools and wares. At the same time, the ownership of produced items is moved from the collective to individual households, allowing for greater economic and political autonomy. This is noticeable as storage of wares and agricultural products become a core part of every household, allowing for greater economic freedom to plan, organize, and barter with resources. As the household became more autonomous and the subsistence economy diversified to a more specialized economy, the production of luxury goods connected to social capital became common, as some households started to cultivate olives, grapes, figs, and flax for clothes. Many aspects of daily life around the late and middle Neolithic would still have been connected to the larger community, especially rituals and ceremonial activities. The household was still secondary to the greater community, and everyone was expected to partake in certain communal activities. Yet increased individual and household freedoms would allow for certain social stratification of late Neolithic society, and the emergence of new social groups and a more diversified material culture. The importance of the household around the later part of the Middle Neolithic can be understood from the increased size of the houses. One of the Middle Neolithic houses at Knossos, the so-called Great Middle Neolithic House, covered around 100 square meters with a multitude of rooms showing separate economic and social function. The sheer size of the walls would even allow for a second story to be constructed, although it should be noted that no more than half of the building has been excavated, due to its position below the palace. The household had to some extent become the center for production of different wares, tools and clothes during the later part of the Neolithic. For example, the production of yarn from wool and flax were made through the use of a spindle, a tool which shows up on most Neolithic sites. The fluffy material could be twisted and spun around a spindle stick, creating a form of yarn. The bottom part of the spindle, the so-called shuttle, would allow for angular momentum to be created, and as the person spun the material into a thin thread in his or her hand, the thread would gather around the spindle stick, creating a string of yarn which later could be weaved together to create clothes. The spindle stick being made out of wood no longer remains, but the spindle shuttle, made out of either clay or stone, can be found throughout most Neolithic sites at Crete. Other tools which could be found throughout the Neolithic are stone tools, such as hammers and axes, which were very common, along with, for example, grinding stones for seeds and chisels for engraving and cutting, as well as obsidian tools and weapons such as spearheads for hunting and, of course, for warfare. So-called bone awls are probably the most common form of bone tools, used for piercing, marking or scraping, either clay, leather or also wood. It's just a good way to decorate various types of wares. It is during the early Neolithic we also start to see the first use of pottery through fired clay. Early Neolithic pottery was in general uncommon, mostly used either as cooking vessels or serving some sort of ceremonial purpose. Due to the fragile nature of these early ceramic vessels, many have doubted whether they were actually used for cooking and instead only reserved for use during ceremonial activities, such as pouring libations or communal feasting. No pottery during this early period is painted, although some pottery was decorated with incisions in a zigzag pattern running around the vessel. Now, due to the pottery being fired above an open flame, the firing of the pottery becomes uneven, and the surface gets a sort of mottled effect with darker patches. The production and use of pottery had been non-existent during the Aceramic period, and then uncommon during the early and middle Neolithic. But it is during the start of the late Neolithic when we see the change towards a more specialized economy and a more autonomous household, we also start to see an increase in the amount of pottery produced, as well as the different types and styles of pottery. Pottery, in a sense, became, during the second half of the Neolithic, more of an everyday item. There are examples of clay ovens, storage jars, pouring and drinking vessels, along with pots, cups, ladles, vases, and pyxes. This increase in pottery production might be due to a more specialized economy, along with technological advances in the firing of pottery. The advent of new pottery shapes also coincides with the cultivation of both grapes for winemaking and olives for olive oil, which might explain why many new forms of pottery often comes in the form of pouring or liquid storage vessels, along with drinking sets and cups. Pottery decoration also becomes more complex and varied, often in size decoration on either a dark or orange background. The incision often creates a geometric pattern such as zigzag, diagonal lines or dots. Some geometric patterns give the pottery the illusion of being weaved, and the incisions were often filled with a form of white paste, which gives the pottery a further contrast between dark and light details. The creation of pottery is closely connected with the creation of figurines, and the later part of the Neolithic sees a noticeable increase in the production of clay figurines, which gives us an insight into the mind of Neolithic humans. Naked female figurines are among the most common of the figurines, with examples of what is referred to as fertility goddesses going back to the Upper Paleolithic around 30,000 years ago, with the Venus of Willendorf from Austria being probably the most famous. These female figurines would exhibit broad hips and rounded features indicating fat storage, fertility, or possibly pregnancy, and they can be found throughout Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean during the Neolithic. Due to the exaggerated body features, these female figurines are often referred to as Steatopygian Venus, referring to the human condition steatopygia, where a substantial level of tissue is gathered on the buttocks and thighs. From Crete, the most famous of these female figurines can be found in Eastern Crete, a clay figurine found just outside of Ierapetra, which displays all the typical exaggerated features of Steatopygian figurines. Whether the figure is supposed to be a fertility goddess or a form of rendition of the idealized fertile female body is difficult to know. What might indicate a religious connection is the decision to shape the head of the figure like a bird, so with a beak, a feature common amongst quite a few figures during the period. In a sense, the bird connects the figure to the natural world, but at the same time, the bird will have a later religious connection to epiphany and to prophecy, although it is difficult to know whether this is the case for this figure. Other figurines lack the great attention to detail which defines the more naturalistic Venus figurines and were instead schematic. A common schematic figurine is the violin outline of the human body. So these violin schematic figurines are common throughout all of the Aegean and are often decorated with incisions in a geometric pattern, like most figurines of the period. For example, this violin figurine from Knossos, which dates to around the late Neolithic, it carries a zigzag pattern running along the body, and the shape of the figure makes it very easy to carry, fitting well into a grasping hand. Therefore, it is not impossible that these figurines function like amulets with religious properties, potentially a form of good luck charm which could be carried. Stashes of various broken figurines have also been found at different sites, which might indicate that the figurines were broken during cult ceremonies or other religious activities. These figurines probably had a variety of functions, ranging from religious use to possibly just toys. Most aspects of Neolithic life are represented in ceramic forms, with figures of animals, household objects, and even boats being found throughout the Aegean. What's worth noting is that figurines are mostly found within areas of high population density, which have made some scholars argue that figurines served a social function within settlements and were a part of social communication between socio-economic groups, arguing that the reason why clay figurines are more frequent in areas with higher population density is due to the existence of socio-economic structures within those areas, unlike areas with less population density, like rural areas outside the major settlements, which would not exhibit the same socio-economic structures, as low population groups tend to display less social stratification. Increased frequency of figurines may also, of course, be a part of the more specialized economy, which tends to define densely populated final and late Neolithic sites. The Middle and Late Neolithic also sees the emergence of a few other large Neolithic sites, such as Katsambas, located north of Knossos, near modern-day Heraklion, and the city of Phaistos and Gortins in the Messara Plains. Caves were still widely inhabited during the late Neolithic, such as the Pelekita cave in eastern Crete by the later Traustalos Peak Sanctuary. Also the Lera cave outside of modern-day Chania and the Sharani cave. These caves would turn from serving a residential function during the Neolithic to a ceremonial and cult function during the Bronze Age. Then during the last part of the Neolithic, the so-called Final Neolithic, Crete and the rest of the Aegean experienced a notable shift in terms of demographics, trade, and socio-economic structure. It seems as if the Final Neolithic saw an increase in migration from nearby areas such as Anatolia, mainland Greece, and the Cycladic Islands. These new inhabitants might have created conflict with the native population, but also created small settlements of their own, mostly along the coast. As a result, Crete quickly became noticeably more populated, and the number of sites increased. Knossos continues to grow and remains the largest site during the Final Neolithic. Interestingly enough, the houses also become more complex. The number of corridors increases just like the number of rooms. The houses excavated at Knossos start to take the same rectilinear form as the later Bronze Age houses, with many doorless spaces, which creates the labyrinth-like layout that the Minoan palaces are known for. The final Neolithic is also the point in time in which we see the last development of the household towards increased autonomy. The distinction between the household and the community become increasingly more noticeable, with more functions being regulated to the household. The household had in a sense turned towards self-sufficiency, able to function and exist independently, creating what has been described as a modular household, able to set up independently of the greater community. Now, a household is generally defined as a single nuclear family in a modern context, but in a Neolithic and Bronze Age context, it extends beyond the nuclear family. It often consists of an extended family of about a dozen or so individuals. As these households could exist independent of a larger community, new sites of either a single household or a small group of households started to develop around small pockets of arable land, sustaining themselves through mixed farming, but also more specialized economic activities such as the cultivation of grapes or olives, the herding of sheep, or the production of certain luxury objects. This also allowed for households to establish themselves around areas more fitting for specialized economic activity than mixed farming. For example, rugged and hilly landscape less fit for farming could be effectively utilized through shepherding. So patches of small networks of interconnected final Neolithic sites came to define the Cretan landscape, with small communities which were connected through trade, gift-giving, and local diplomacy. A more specialized economy necessitated longer and more complex trade routes with a wider network of trading partners. As trade increased, so did the importance of controlling resources and luxury goods. Many of the later final Neolithic sites are found along the coast. Utilizing maritime trade, establishing connections with other sites around the Aegean, such as the Peloponnese, the Cyclades, and the Attica-Kephala culture around the Saronic Gulf on mainland Greece. Trade becomes an efficient way for successful communities to prosper and acquire non-local materials and wares which previously were unavailable. Controlling the production or trade of goods and wares would allow for households to accumulate extensive personal wealth and acquire elevated social and economic status within the region and local community. The continuation of the individualization of the household in the final Neolithic continued the social stratification of society, which is why we start to see the emergence of a part of the economy centered around prestige items, an important aspect of the economy which will further develop during the Bronze Age. This emerging economy, centered around prestige and luxury items, combined with more extensive trade networks, might explain why we start to see the first form of metallurgy during the end of the final Neolithic period on Crete. Although finished metal objects have been found around numerous Cretan final Neolithic sites, the emergence of raw materials, such as raw copper and obsidian, along with the necessary tools for smelting and processing raw metals into finished products, defines a new stage in the economic and technological development on Crete. Crucibles for the smelting of metals along with the slag, so slag being the rest product from smelting metal ores, show up around various large coastal settlements by the final Neolithic. As Crete naturally lacks any metal deposits, the influx of raw materials must indicate the existence of both an extensive trade network within and around the Mediterranean, along with an ambition to control the production and distribution of prestige items. It is also noticeable that these successful coastal settlements which start to pop up around the final Neolithic engaged in a high degree of trade between one another, especially in terms of prestige items made of metal, since very few metal objects have been found around inland sites. So, to sort of sum up the Neolithic on Crete, we can see that at the end of the Neolithic, the prerequisite for the Bronze Age were firmly established. The transformation of the household to an autonomous entity, able to function independent of a large community. The development of a more specialized economy, which enabled the production of luxury goods, the cultivation of various crops, the increased social stratification, the development of large urban centers like Knossos and Phaistos, an extensive large-scale trade network which brought metals to Crete, and most importantly, the advent of metallurgy.